Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Tamisha Williams, we're really excited to have you. I'm
Thank
Zach
you.
Ritter. Yes, yes, thank you. I'm Zach Ritter. I'm a friend of Joe Brooks and a friend of Community Works Institute. And um, Tamisha has done some work with Community Works Institute. For those that don't know, since 1995, Community Works Institute has been a K through 16 education spot, and through storytelling and social justice initiatives, and through the Winter Work Institute that's coming up. Check it out on the website. They do some really cool work. Community Works Institute, nonprofit that's dedicated to educating folks about ethnography, storytelling, and how to bring the community into the classroom. And so I've gone to some of the workshops, institutes, and they're powerful. It's cool. It's good stuff. Check it out. Um, all right. So just for those that don't know, I'm Zach Ritter, and I am Dean of Students at Cal State Dominguez Hills in Los Angeles, California. Um, Joe Brooks just told us an interesting story about Los Angeles and how it's viewed throughout the nation, but I won't repeat that one. But yes, and I teach at UCLA and Laverne and Redlands and Dominguez about social justice history. And so this show kind of came about as to bring folks that are doing impactful work in the community to get them to just have a wider, larger audience. And so that's why Tamisha Williams is here today, who's been, man, correct me if I'm wrong, New Mexico, San Francisco, uh, Virginia, doing racial justice work, equity and inclusion work in the K through 12, maybe 16 space. But tell us about who you are. You're super impressive. I'm humbled and honored to be on a session with you.
Thank you. Okay, who I am. I'll do a short version, and then you can tell me what you want to know more about. But um, so yes, I'll start with Virginia because that's where I'm from. Born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and I have spent time in other places, and my work in schools has been what kind of had me on those travels. So originally, and I'm just going to go in and name this now that I have a dog that's jealous when I'm on Zoom because he's like, what about me? So if he pops up, he pops up. It'll be a treat for you all. Um, so yeah, from Richmond, Virginia, have always been interested in education and especially education and the ways that I could support learners beyond the classroom, never knowing what that would look like. As I was young. Um, I actually have a background in art and education and also family and marriage counseling. And those particular skills I think help me every day in the work that I do. I started off in actually doing college admission after I got my counseling degree, and honestly used a lot of counseling in the college admission realm. So I do have that 16 experience, that K through 16 experience. But in moving to New Mexico, I actually wanted to look at their public school system, but because my teaching degree didn't transfer there, I was open up to the world of independent schools, and that's where my first position started as a director of university initiatives. So that was 3 years in New Mexico in that role, 4 years coming out of San Francisco, serving in a similar capacity, and now back in Virginia, serving as the director of equity and community initiatives at the Potomac School. So I've been out and then come right back when around home to Virginia.
I love it. I love it. I'm gonna pause for a minute just because we might be having technical issues. Um, I can hear you really well,
And I
Joe.
can hear you well.
I can hear you, Joe. Do we want to be on Facebook Live? I noticed that Facebook Live is not on there yet. Okay. Okay. All right. I guess we're gonna get it going soon. All right. Well, Facebook users maybe. All right. Um, so tell us about what was San Francisco like? And tell us about the work that you were doing there.
Sure. Yeah. I think first, what I'll say is that every place outside of Virginia has been culture shock to me in different ways.
Mhm.
Because definitely being in, I think, Virginia for 28 years before I left it, my assumption was that everywhere was similar. Like, it's a foolish assumption, but and I knew you know it's not, and at the same time, you can't really think about all of the different ways that places are different. So San Francisco to me, it felt more aligned with who I was than New Mexico. Like there was water around and more of a city life, which I was definitely used to from Richmond. But
Mhm.
I was not used to the what's the word I'm looking for? The expense.
Mm.
That was, I mean, yeah, like just blown out of the water. By just the high living that was taking place there. I remember getting my job in February, but I wasn't going to be moving until the next school year, and tracking apartments, and every month watching the apartment price go up $100 until I moved. And so I was like, okay, so this budget I had, like I should have been negotiating for way more than I was, because already moving, I was out of budget
Yeah.
by, $500-600 because yeah. So that right there was whew. San Francisco to me though it was again really beautiful. Like having been in Virginia, when I thought about the ways that like what diversity looked like to me, what it looked like to be around folks that were different than me. Um, it was helpful for me to leave Virginia and also see what that looked like in other places.
Mhm.
And for San Francisco to have, I think the large Asian population for me was very new.
Mm.
And was something that was again helpful for me to adjust to and recognize like my position and everything. Um, at the same time, it was jarring as well because I felt like the further west I moved, the more stereotypes about the South people had,
Interesting.
and assumptions of, oh, you must be so excited to be here and not Virginia, like, and gosh, when I told them I was moving back to Virginia, it was this like, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? Like the
'Cause
racism.
right, you mentioned this in the other conversation. Oh, it's so racist over there, and you were like,
Yes.
"Right."
Well, let me. So yeah, so I think that was jarring for me going to both New Mexico and California, but definitely San Francisco because I think people see it as a very progressive place, right? Which it is in some accounts. And then there can be a way in which any place can get really excited about the work that they've done over time and not keep that critical examination going. So that was challenging for me to share experiences, um, right, racist experiences that occurred in that area, and folks being like, well, maybe you weren't seeing it, from the right perspective, and realizing like, wow, so that's actually not safe. Like it feels safer for me to be in a place in which everyone can agree on what's happening at the time, and we can work towards each other's safety, than to be in a place where folks are denying um
Mhm.
some of what's happening. And that wasn't everywhere, right? But it definitely was. It was new to me.
Mhm.
So yeah, but I enjoyed San Francisco for what it was, but I still every day was like, man, how do I get back to Virginia? Like it's just this, yeah, this is home. This is home.
Well, so I want to get into that overt racism versus that subtle racism.
Ooh,
But first, let's take a step back in because there's a lot of K through 16 educators who are in the session. Tell us about your K through 16 experience and how that maybe shaped you in wanting to get into this line of work.
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So K through 12 for me was in Richmond Public Schools. Shout out to Richmond, Virginia. Um, so RPS, it's a, public schooling K through 12, predominantly from my lens back then, predominantly Black surroundings. I'm sure that if I go back and look, there was a lot more diversity happening, but from this Black child who has a Black family and was in a Black church, and like my friendship groups, that's what I saw around me. I saw teachers that looked like me as well.
Mm.
Um so yeah, I think growing up, it probably was around, it was nearing high school, middle school, late middle school, high school, when I started to realize like, oh, wait, my public schools don't look like the county public schools. Because I went to a church where folks were in Richmond public schools, but also Chesterfield and Henrico. And I remember the first choir rehearsal where my friend showed up with iPads and iMacs. And
Mm,
I was like, how does this work? And they were like, oh, they're one-to-one programs. I was like, wait, so you all got computers through your school, and I know I'm going to go to my high school and we're still going to be working off of like 95 Windows, trying to boot them up. And guys, that's it, right? And so at that point, I think I definitely started also questioning, like, okay, so just understanding, right, your place in things, and still not fully aware. I wasn't going out and researching. I just was kind of things I knew.
mm,
Richmond was one thing. County schools are going to have more, right? Oh, and county schools also have more white people, and starting to associate that.
mm,
But I loved my K through 12 experience. And I also can look back at it now and recognize all of the ways in which other folks, especially who weren't tracked in the ways
mm,
I was tracked, did not benefit from
mm,
that experience. And that not being, just specific educators' faults, but also the faulty system we have,
mm,
around the funding of public education and so on. So enjoyed my K through 12 experience, especially my high school experience, which I think gave me definitely then the, like, this catalyst of like, wait, why isn't everyone receiving this education?
mm,
Because my high school, I actually attended it's called a magnet program.
mm,
So it wasn't a charter,
mm,
and it wasn't my zone school, and I
mm,
applied to it. There were about 48 of us in my class, right?
mm,
And there could be some schools where there are 48 in the classroom.
mm,
Um, we all knew that we were all coming from all different parts of Richmond to
mm,
this particular school. And after that first year, I'm looking around. I'm like, well, if we know that this works, if we, like, none of us are special, right? Like, we know our peers who are at our zone schools, like, who are just as smart. Like, why wouldn't the city just build schools to be like this if this works for people?
mm,
Small class sizes, having access to things. Like, we didn't have a bunch of security guards running around. We had, the ability to have some flexibility and trust in our space. Classes we enjoyed, the way teachers taught. And so, like, that also stuck in my head of like, why? Like, this
mm,
is frustrating. We know it works.
mm,
Um, and so I really then thought about wanting to work with students again, like, how can I be that additional support for students beyond the classroom? Then my after graduating, I went to the University of Richmond, and that's where then that first real, like, reality of like, oh, like,
mm,
everyone, definitely didn't go through the same schooling as me. Was there culture shock around whiteness for sure? That was my first predominantly white schooling experience. Um, yeah, and even listening to my friends who were going to HBCUs and other schools, and comparing some of our experiences, or state public colleges versus my private education, and again, just watching the privilege,
mm,
um, layer on, and thinking about folks who have had that, educational privilege since K through 12 versus someone who jumps into it, and the
mm,
level of, like, ownership you have over that experience. Was
mm,
I thinking about all that at the time? No.
mm,
I think my body was just going through the experience. I can definitely look back though, right, and recognize some of the,
mm.
questions I was asking, or things I was adjusting to.
Did you ever wish you went to an HBCU?
No, I'm sure looking back, then I would be like, oh yeah, I'll totally look into it. I don't see it as like a regret decision. I'll
Mm,
say that. Like, I wish I had actually taken more advantage of, like, road trips and going to, like, other folks' homecoming, like things like that, definitely.
mm,
So I don't regret the decision of going to a PWI. I think it worked for who I was. And I know some of my friends that I would have been like, yeah, no, you would hate it here. Like, so that whole, like, this is the best school. It's like, no, find the school that works for you,
mm,
because I could navigate that, but other folks, like, you shouldn't have to if it doesn't,
mhm.
So yeah.
What do you, okay, being at a PWI, for those that are not familiar, predominantly white institution,
Yes.
did that help you uh, do the equity and inclusion work you do now? Because, um, I don't want to be weird about it, but like, you got to dive a little bit into the white mind and understand what some of those folks are thinking, and
Yeah.
and the bridge between communities.
Yeah. And what I'll say is, like, no, I think, because my awareness, right? Like, I think there's a lot that I can look back on. I feel like I was much more aware in grad school when I went to William and Mary.
Mm,
And again, that awareness came from being like, I show up and there are a lot of things I'm paying for that at University of Richmond, everything was rolled into tuition, right? So like I could just show up at the gym and take classes, and I was printing, and I wasn't paying for printing. And I remember printing my first thing at William and Mary, and that like credit came up, and I was like, what is this world? So again, it's these layers, right, of like revealing themselves, of like the layers of privilege that I've had, educational privilege, just kind of revealing themselves. So I wasn't mindful, I think, and I also I didn't see University of Richmond. I didn't go into it as like, this is my opportunity to expand myself in this multicultural environment. No, I was like, hello, Black folks, we need to stay together. What is this? Like, so I very much, I mean, there are a few folks like, yeah, I didn't jump out into new experiences, because for me, I was, what can I really trust here? Um,
mm,
yeah.
mm,
And probably not even the thought process of what can I trust, just like
mm,
automatic, like, yeah, here are my folks.
mm,
Here's where I'm going to stay. Unless someone tells me directly, this is a place you can go and be safe. And
mm,
those were the moments when I would then extend. So like my education teachers, because I was a minor in education, those professors I still think about, right, their pedagogy.
mm.
And I was going to drop the education minor, because
Yeah.
I was like, listen, I can only do but so much, and I'm doing way too much. So something's got to go. And I know I don't want to be a full-time teacher. I know I just want to have education background. So I'm gonna let this go.
Yeah.
And they actually took me out to lunch. They were like, "Can you just come to lunch with us before you make your decision?" And I was like, "Sure, all right." And it was two. Oh gosh, and I'm not gonna say either of their names now, because one of them I'm gonna mess up. So I'm gonna, but you all know who you are. There are two professors. They took me out to lunch in actually the like faculty lunch room. But essentially, like what they told me is, they spoke the affirmations to me about like, no, like you are needed in the education field, and this is important, and here's what we see in you. And then also, told me about a research experience that I could do. Like, otherwise, those things, like for me, I was like, if I didn't see myself in it, which I wouldn't have because I didn't have that experience. We weren't doing research, we were doing research in high school, but not the level at which I saw University of Richmond doing it at the time. So I counted myself out of those. So it
Mm,
was helpful to have those kind of guides, right? And those were two white women.
mm,
But I trusted them because I had been in their class, and I trusted the way they taught. I saw how they responded to things. I could see how they navigated.
mm.
So I stayed I stayed in the minor, and they let me student teach after I graduated. So I wasn't doing too much.
Damn,
Um,
that's really
but
that's powerful. What did it mean to you in your K through 12 experience to have uh, teachers that looked like you?
everything. It's hard for me to imagine, like when I'm at schools where people give the demographic breakdowns, racial demographic breakdowns of the faculty and staff versus students, and there's a majority or high number of students of color and complete opposite in the faculty staff. It's always mind-boggling to me.
Mm,
And again, my elementary school probably did have more white teachers than I knew, but there were also key like Black figures around me, like the counselor, right? Like,
mm,
and she had such a powerful presence in the school. And then there were Black teachers that all of us were like, hoping for in a career. But even outside of their classrooms, they had powerful presence in the school. So I didn't feel like, that I was missing that experience. And then in my life, like I wasn't really missing, Black educators, because my mom was one, so
mm,
but then when I think like 6 through 12, it was powerful, right? As I'm really coming into my identity, like Black adults who weren't afraid of like setting limits and checking me, but also like empowering and also being able to see their cool personalities as adults
mm,
was really, like, oh, I don't, there's so many ways to be
mm,
Black. Like there wasn't just the two Black teachers. And now if they made a mistake, it was, oh gosh, it was no, here are a whole bunch of, Black folks. And they're so different. None of them are alike.
mm.
We loved it. I love to tell stories about some of them. There's one teacher who she used her middle finger as a pointer. She's amazing. But I know that representation was so strong. And again, I don't think I thought about it
Mm,
like I didn't wake up in the morning or reflect at night like it is really powerful for me. But being in like being in places where the lack of it was, that's when I was like, oh my gosh, I am so glad my K through 12 foundation, right? Like,
Mm.
because I've definitely met Black kids in independent schools who like their first Black teacher is a 10th grade, is in 10th grade. And I'm like, what is, and then there's so many expectations for this teacher to be
Right.
perfect, to get it right.
Right.
You are the thing. It's like, it's not, So I'm really grateful because it's not something I had to think about or worry about, but it's all reflecting, right? Like it totally had an impact on me, whether I could verbalize it or not.
Mm. Were you aware that you were being tracked?
No. Okay, yes and no. Yes and no. Oh man, I even like 4 years ago, I had this like moment of like, oh my gosh, the ways in which I was talking about. Okay, so no, there was our schools, right? Like uh Fisher Model Elementary School or Fred D. Thompson Model Middle School, like though there were the things in there, right? Or me being in the like the space program for gifted and talented kids, or so all of those pieces were present, and I knew I was a part of those things, or I knew I was taking a test for this.
Mm.
But I was socialized in a way to kind of believe that, like, yeah, this is right. Like, I'm supposed to be, going through this. Even our middle school was, there were this hallway for the kids who are taking the grade level above, and you got this hallway for, you're right on the level. And I stayed on my little hallway.
Mm.
I went to where I needed to go in that building and stay with my folks. So, and then that led to me being right at the high school that I was at. So
Mm.
when I look back at it, I'm like, oh yeah, I was tracked. And I think about some of the like relationships and friendships. Like there are some people who, because I didn't do, some of the extracurriculars like sports or band, where you really just have a mix of everyone there. I really don't know, right? A lot of folks outside of sometimes my little band who is in my group.
Mm.
So yeah, no, I didn't really recognize what was happening in
Mm.
terms of the impact that it was having until, yeah, further back. And again, I think it was in high school where we all started being like, okay, so what, like
Mm.
this, we know what works. This isn't magical. Like why, that question of why not? Yeah.
I ask because I think we focus on issues of race, which, without saying that, well, with what happened last week, I mean, we're just seeing the issues of race that we haven't worked out, obviously, in this country and around the world.
Yeah.
The chickens
Yeah.
are coming home to roost, as Malcolm X would say. And it's never just about race. And
Correct.
it's about class, and it's about gender, sexuality.
Oh yeah.
So in your K through 12 or K through 16 experience, and then I want to get into your career, were there moments in terms of gender, sexuality, or class that are like, whoa, that stood out for me?
Like systemic ones
Systemic or
or just
personal.
any.
You're in a class with someone and you're like, for example, I went to public schools in LA, and I was one of the only white Jewish kids there. And I remember being in gym with, what was his name? Timothy. And we were friends, and I, could tell that he had a different background. He would talk about what was happening at his house, and like, it seemed a little bit more chaotic than what was happening at my house. And I was really into these Kobe's that I had. And I was like, yeah, but like, they're getting really raggedy, and I'm probably going to throw them out.
Mm,
I can't really use them anymore. And he was like, oh, can I have them? And I was like, oh, I mean, and then
yeah.
in that moment, like, I didn't want to make it awkward. And it all hit me like, he's going to use them. And I was about
Yeah.
to. And so there's,
Then just discard them.
right. And there's privilege happening. There's race. There's all of it right here, right
Yes.
now. And I was like, of course you can have them. But were there moments like that where you're like,
Yeah. Yeah, I would say some of that, and again, I think a lot of that showed up after the fact, especially I think having conversations with folks now as adults and hearing about kind of the parallel lives that we led. Um, in the same building, but different neighborhoods and different households, because I wasn't having those conversations. And that, when I talk to folks about privilege, I'm like, yes, we talk a lot about white privilege because we need to. And there's a whole lot of other, privileges that exist. And I can, like, a big part of my, identity wheel is like privilege, privilege, privilege. And so I was sheltered from a lot of those circumstances where it's like, it's not that I was sheltered purposely, but I didn't even have to think about some of those. And, or I'm sure my parents would be like, girl, we had to think about that. But I personally didn't, you know? And so because of that, it was really a late in life where I was like, oh, wow, like, and I do think about some of the ways, and I'm sure I did impact people because of my lack of awareness.
Mm,
Um, in terms of a couple things though around the gender piece, right?
mm,
Really small though, I would say, is I just remember like the first moment where I was like, wait, what? Like women can also think like lowly of other women was in middle school gym class, and the PE teacher was a Black woman, right? Like exciting to me.
mm,
And we were learning a new unit on soccer. I'm on the soccer team, so I'm like ready. Like, um, guys, going outside and play soccer. Girls, we're gonna stay inside and learn how to kick.
mm.
Just this moment for me of, huh,
Right.
okay, so this is how this works. And again, I think some of those then moments, which are like small and like a one time,
Mm,
are still defining in terms of then the way that whenever I do hear young girls talk about like limiting what they can do, or either hear young boys kind of, like, oh no, no, we're all equal. There is no, reason why you should feel like you can't do, like, no, let's talk about the honesty of gendered experiences that are happening.
mm,
So I do find myself now making sure to be more proactive, understanding that these little, like, I'm sure that teacher does not,
mm,
I could find that teacher and be like, do you remember this? No. But for me, right, it was that moment. And so how to make sure to try to eliminate those moments as much as possible,
mhm,
for
mm,
youth today, because it's just the small ones. Like I still to this day can't remember which middle school teacher like looked at all the girls in the class and was like, you can change your mind at any time. And now whenever I'm around, girls, I always share that, because I remember to this day, like in those hard decision moments I have, I'm like, no, you can change your mind anytime. Like it doesn't matter if it's inconvenient for anybody else.
mm,
So
mm,
those moments to me,
mm,
yeah, were
mm,
powerful.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. So I have done diversity and inclusion work at some elite schools, at some non-elite schools, and you do similar work, but I'm a white Jewish guy, and so the way I show up in spaces and the way people react, mostly white administrators react to me is different.
Mm.
Um, tell us about your experience in diversity and inclusion work. Have you seen differences at elite schools and non-elite schools?
Hmm. What can I ask about your framing of the word elite?
Sure, you please. Yes. I don't know. I should say I have been at schools that are uh, elite, that are predominantly white, and are have a lot of money, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
pressure, not only put on the students, but when it comes to DEI work, it is much more policed. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you or I, as the DEI, diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion, for folks that don't know,
It's like 10 names.
yeah, I know, yeah, there's a lot. I would like to call it just justice work, but uh, you and I, in these positions, are put in a very difficult place because it is don't do too much, because if you do too much, it's going to mess with our elite status, our money, and the donors are not going to like it if we're pushing too hard.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And here's the reason why I asked about, like, I wasn't trying to, throw something back at you, but it was, so I'll say this quickly and then answer your question. When I got my first job at an independent school, I saw like independent schools, not knowing anything about them, as like elite, right? I had just come from recruiting at University of Richmond. And I remember my first fair was at like a K through 12 boarding school in Connecticut, and being like, literally parking my rental car. I felt like the folks on Jurassic Park. It's one of my favorite movies. But you remember when, are they paleontologists, when they first get out the Jeep, when they first see the the dinosaur, and they're like, oh my gosh, and looking at it, like that was literally me. Like I got out of the rental car, like, and just like scanning. Like I came from a a campus that was so many acres, and these kids had this K through 12, and that, like, in that instant I was like, oh, this is the education gap. Whatever else we're trying to talk about. Like, no, if a kindergartner is on a campus that looks like my private college, which is now over 60,000 a year and has all the resources I had as a 18 and 20-year-old, no wonder when I'm reading applications, like it's all of these things started firing. Well, then when I actually started working in one, right? So I brought all of my stereotypes, and working in one, to being like, okay, these kids, right? This different caliber of kids, because at the, fairs, they're coming up to me and shaking my hand, and, all these different pieces. Like after the first week, I'm like, these are normal, regular, schmegular kids who just go to a tuition-based institution. and there was an elite status that I was putting on them in the school, that also, like, I ran every action and interaction through, and in some ways just kind of like, oh my gosh, what's happening. So it helped me to like also come down to earth in terms of like what was really elite. It might be a status that folks hold, but the actual innards of most of these places, like, yeah, if you drop anybody in places that have these resources and that have this level of storytelling about themselves, everyone could be elite. So that's why I ask, right? And in many ways I could see how, there are some folks who even look at like the high school I went to, which was a public school, but like, it has blue ribbons and all these different pieces, as elite for the area. So yeah, if I'm thinking about schools, first of all, the positions that I hold, I've only seen at independent and private institutions. And I've been away from the public school in a while. So I feel like I know public school districts that have these roles now, but not the school, right? And so doing this work it's, I would say, mind-boggling every day. It is an adjustment every day. In terms of just recognizing that I'm showing up, often countercultural. Like like just me being in the place sometimes is in some ways like, wow, like we've got a Black woman with natural hair who's from Richmond. She's queer, like, wow, like, those pieces, like not being something that then there are like 10 of us around the campus. And then in other ways, like feeling like the work is very personal to me. So then when there are those like barriers or roadblocks or dismissiveness of like what I'm saying is like, no, this is, what's happening, also feels really personal. So yeah, doing this work in these schools, like tuition driven institutions, especially, it does not feel as free flowing and as expansive and as radical as I think some of them are, some of the positions are framed to be, because there always is then coming back to this bottom line, right? Even the best of intention institution has to navigate that. And it's different, right? If like their founding is, social justice founding, and there are, I'm sure, some institutions out there that, I haven't done research on, but yeah, I think that there's so much that comes into play, the power dynamics of it all, the economics of it all. And if a school is also fearful of their financial standing and talking about systems of oppression are going to shake the boat or rock the boat for those givers that they still hold on to, even more friction, right? Even though for me, I see it as like, I'm fine shaking that boat until everybody who's questioning this fall off, and then we're going to make this stronger, because I know people will come out the woodworks when they know what we're really about. But that's easier said from my framework than the framework that those institutions have been built upon and what people are used to. Right. So that like navigating, going against the status quo,
Mm.
like to build yourself up every day to do that, like it's emotional and physical work that I think not everyone recognizes goes into these positions,
Mm.
like how personal it is, how
Mm.
much, like work it takes to also do them, gearing up for conversations. And I still have to navigate my people pleaser self. So I'm not like some of the folks in these positions who I love watching, who are just like hard hitting and stay. And I'm like, that's it. Let me watch this again. So I can, and I still go into my like, so let's unpack this. So it's even more work I gotta do.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I totally understand what you're saying. I mean, some of
Yeah.
the meetings let's just say some of them you could be more Martin and some of them you could be more Malcolm. But you have to be able to code switch and
Hmm.
know, or
Yeah.
more Bell Hooks or more Angela Davis, or more
Yeah.
Audrey Lorde.
But then can I
Go.
can I touch on
Yeah.
something, because you asked earlier, or you were mentioning earlier, just even some of, right, the intersections of your own identity, um that show up in your work. And I think that's the other piece, right, is even like having the role that I have, and they've been at administrative levels at the schools that I've been at, which is excellent, like right as they should be. There's still the power dynamics that show up, not just because of my position, but also because, right, I'm like showing up as, a Black woman. So I'm like, how do I navigate, the like white male privilege of a boss who may not also know that they're operating in that way. So so then the counselor in me comes out to try to like navigate, what's happening there. But yeah, that, like, even that piece, right? So and I'll tell folks in my faculty and staff and my student body as well, that I serve, like, I'm willing to take risks that you shouldn't have to take, because I am getting paid for this position to do it. And personally, I know that I still walk into these spaces like, okay, how do I, like
Mm.
adjusting for all of the different dynamics that are going to be happening, depending on the role of the person who I'm, showing up. Like I have a lot more ease in talking with faculty members about, let's navigate this, than I might have showing up at the administrative table.
Mm.
Doesn't mean that I can't do it, but the workings up that have to prepare for that, especially if I know that folks around that table don't have the level of awareness that I would love for them to have for this conversation.
Mm.
um yeah.
Mm. Yeah, there was so much. The film Get Out comes to mind, because
Mm,
you never know how you are read, or maybe in your case you do know. You can take a guess about how you're going to be read. Um, but I was having a conversation with a president of a university, and they said,
mm,
"Well, I don't think of you as white. I think of you as Jewish." And it
mm,
was very interesting because it felt very 1950s overt racism, right? We were going to talk about the overt and
mhm,
covert. And I was kind of taken off guard, but I also know, being socialized, um, like, yeah, whatever, in LA, you're pretty safe being Jewish. But I always knew that there's that, my dad's refugee, grandparents in Auschwitz. And so there's always that thing in the back of your head of like, these are Anglo whites, and maybe they don't have your best whatever in mind.
mm,
And just because what
mhm.
happened 70 years ago is not happening doesn't mean that
Yeah,
those things don't still live on in people's hearts and minds. So,
absolutely.
right. And so that was weird, and obviously didn't feel safe in that moment. But I'm sure as a Black woman, it's 1,000 times worse. So I can't imagine. Um, but you hit upon this thing, and this is my philosophy as well. These institutions can get more power or more prestige and more money if they kind of do that Heidegger. I mean, ironically, the Jewish guy's quoting Heidegger, who's a big anti-Semite, but Heidegger said, if you push past your fear of death, you can really
Okay.
live. Okay, so if they push past their
Okay.
fear of being seen as too progressive or
I
too
see.
whatever, they could actually get more
Hmm.
prestige and all these different things. And the thing that always struck me as a question mark is, it's actually not a big secret about how to change these institutions.
Yeah.
But as
Yeah.
Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And so you and I are working
Mhm.
against probably hundreds of years of culture. And I guess if we
Oh yeah.
move the needle a couple inches, that's progress.
It is progress, and then a piece of me on a regular basis, right? As I like, so as when I was in New Mexico, when I was in San Francisco, and as I have gotten steeped into independent schools every day, like not only did I yearn to be like, oh man, Virginia's home for me, I love it, but I also like, I want to go back to my like community, right? Like that public school community to me, like, um, and my experience there and wanting to give back to that. So there's also a piece of me that knows that like I can move, and I think this is where I have to, like pause and understand impact. But I
Mm-hmm.
have to remind myself that like I can remove myself from the equation and they'll be fine. Like I
Mm,
could leave tomorrow and
interesting.
they'll be fine. Because like
They'll be
they
fine,
will be, right? Like
but they might revert back to their old ways because then you're not the guide on the side.
we'll agree. But
Yeah.
so then that's where I that's when I say like, well, then I am definitely questioning my longevity here, because if it's so easy for you to do that,
Yeah. Yeah.
then where's the foundation of folks who, so it's like, it's complex, right? But so I hear you. It's like, I don't question the impact I'm having.
Yeah.
And I know that like any, impact is impact. I do believe in ripple effects, right? Like that's one of the things that, when I went through a coaching class this summer and we talked about our coaching philosophy, like I do believe in that ripple effect,
Mm, mm,
and um and I have to, be real about the reality of the spaces that I am
right.
a part of and how much to survive.
Yes. Yeah.
And so because of that, their desire to change has to come from somewhere else,
Hmm.
because status quo is actually going to help them survive given what we saw
Right.
this week, right? Like so it's like there's so so for that reason it's like, and I don't remember who told me this and at what point. I feel like it was somewhere between grad school and working at University of Richmond, and they were like, well, you're not God, Tamisha, right? Like when I was talking about not being able to be somewhere, and oh my gosh, like you're kind of seeing myself as like, if I'm not there, this whole thing is going to fall apart. And that reminder was so helpful for me. I'm like, you're right, listen, yes, I have impact places I go, and also if it's just me,
Mhm.
that's the only thing that's a marker of the impact, that's not sustainable, that's not healthy, probably has some work to do there.
Mm,
um
mm,
yeah,
mm,
yeah, so it's, I find value in what I do, and I hope that those ripple effects become waves in a lot of
mm.
places really soon,
Right.
because I that yeah.
Right. Right. For and I I'm vibing with you on the ripple effect because that's my philosophy as well. For folks that are tuning in and they're like,
Yeah.
look, we have like uh, racial literacy workshops. We're trying to dissect our whiteness. We look at Jones and Okun's article about white supremacy culture. We're trying to identify. We got Black Lives Matter signs around the thing, whatever, and we have
Oh,
this
the signs.
the signs, the
Yes.
signs, and
Everyone is welcome here.
correct, and we have X number of Black students this year. We have X number of Latinx students. We even have X number of queer students this year. I, and that's good. That's a good start, right? But I think I think you and I
Diversity.
diversity ground floor. But right, Dr. Defina Lazarus Stewart says, how do you go from diversity to justice? And I think that's where our work comes in.
Mm,
But it's not. I want to say this clearly. It's not rocket science,
sure.
but taking people's hands and getting towards justice actually is rocket science, right? And so someone who's
Yeah.
listening to this and is like, hey, like what else do you want us to do? Like, how do we get to this promised land, this justice place? My quick one-liner is you have to desegregate your donors, you have to desegregate your board of trustees, you have to desegregate your board of directors, and just like any company in America that's now thinking since George Floyd's death, like halfway through last year, is like, I don't know, it's kind of late in the game to now starting to think that you have to
Yes.
pick it up. But I think I know the answer to this, but why is it so difficult for these institutions to change their power structures and share some of the wealth and have Black and brown board of trustee members, Black and brown and queer, donors.
You're smiling as you ask this question. So okay,
Why is this so hard?
because they don't need to.
Okay.
I mean, to
Yeah.
survive.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's no, I like I remember okay, when I was working at the University of Richmond, I started making t-shirt necklaces. I don't know, saw something on YouTube where like you can cut a t-shirt across and you stretch the material and it coils up really beautifully.
Cool.
And people were like, "Oh, I want one." I was like, "All right, sure, I'll make t-shirt necklaces." And I had my friends, I took pictures of them and put them up on like a little Google site.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Budding entrepreneur.
Oh yeah.
And I remember having a white woman say to me, like, you should really look at also making sure that you've got, just a diversity of folks modeling the necklaces, so that folks know that, and I got what she was saying.
Uh-huh.
And again, though, in that moment, right, it was like, right, you will need to see yourself, like as a white person, I want to see a white person modeling this. So I know, like, if I see all Black people modeling it, maybe it's not for me, but I'm supposed to also, right, and this is not about her, this is about the system, right? Like I'm supposed to look at all of like whiteness everywhere and be able to see myself and be like, yeah, no, I belong. It's
White America invented FUBU. White America is always, sorry, but go ahead. Sorry. I mean, the other FUBU, not
so it's like,
FUBU, sorry.
So that, I don't know, in some ways, I understand why they haven't. It's not, and it's not because things are working well everywhere. It's not because people aren't being harmed. It's not because, and people still continue to give, people still continue to enroll, people still continue to, so for me, every year, right, that I remain in independent schools, I always wonder, what would have happened if this level of giving, like what were happening in the public schools, slashers shouldn't even have to, because the government should be, paying for it. But so I'm going to pay into the system that then I want to like curate and craft for myself. And if these other things are counter to what we're used to doing, which is going to be conflict and friction, and I can't imagine what benefit that would be other than what we have, because what we have is really good. Look at us. Why, right? And so and that's a lot to work through. And I remember once telling one of my heads of schools, like, I would rather schools say to their constituent, like to their communities, we're not going to focus on diversifying right now. What we're going to focus on doing is making sure that our community is like equitable and welcoming for everyone who's here and anyone we could imagine being here, whether they are, right? And then just list every identity.
Right.
Instead, what happens is like, quick, diversify, right? And then we get folks in and then we're like, oh man, what are you like, right? Like we haven't thought about it. So for me, when I think about like what more people can do, truth telling on multiple levels is one, right? Like just telling the truth about why we are the way we are as an institution or as a teacher, as a class, as a, and why we want to do what we think we should be doing right now. Like, is it because someone told us? And be honest about that. And then just do some questioning, asking about like, what do we think the benefits would be? What do we think the challenge, like just taking that time. And, that article, the white supremacist culture article, or that you talked about, right? Like, we know that sense of urgency, right, is on there, right? This false sense of urgency. If George Floyd was your wake-up call and you were a grown adult, right? Like I question then the quick things you're doing, other than quickly jumping into spaces that allow you to do some really deep reflection before you do any action. But that's not the case, especially of our predominantly white institutions, I would say too, because we have to like show that look at us producing, look at us changing, look at us, So that just the truth telling, like folks being able to be uncomfortable with like, here's where I am,
Mhm.
because I've seen some of the most like amazing growth happen from folks who can just name vulnerably, here's where I am, knowing that what they're saying out of their mouth is like, I know this is not going to land well for people, and like, fine. But
Yeah.
like for a person like me, I'd rather coach that person,
Mhm.
like, don't come to me as just a random Black person on the street, but like, if I'm signing up for that, I would rather coach that person than the person who's like, I know I'm supposed to do this, so I'm here,
Yeah.
but can't actually, tell the truth about, maybe be a person of color who has anti-Blackness, like, it doesn't want to talk about the anti-Blackness, right? Like, that's floating around their head, or, you know, like, just let's do some truth telling about ourselves, about where we are, because then we can actually figure out what we need. Um, and then truth telling related to like history.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah. Well,
I
yes.
don't know.
No, no. Well,
Where we are as a country, how we got
right.
here. Like, so yeah, like, so that whole like, what do we do next? It's like, it's actually that we should actually be pausing.
Yeah.
A whole lot of us should have paused, in the spring, and instead of jumping to things like, I don't, somebody needs to do a study and say how many, DEI positions popped up at organizations and schools between the spring and December.
Hmm.
And I've questioned those, right? Like, if that was the first opportunity for you, is that person in that position going to be set up to succeed if you didn't actually take the time to pause and say, all right, what, like, where are we? Who are we?
Right.
What is, how did we get here, to then know what that person's going to be walking into?
Right. Right. Right.
And that, that piece for me is, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Because then you're asking someone to sign up at an institution that's probably going to traumatize them, is probably not going to be a good scene because they haven't done the work to make sure that all those identities that you just mentioned are going to be welcome. You're talking about truth telling, and we just had a week of you know, a lot of officially condoned violent white supremacy, right? The overt not the quiet part of the violence and the
Yeah.
racism. So we still haven't really, I mean, 1619 Project has tried to teach America about its own last 400 years of enslavement and Black Holocaust and Native American Holocaust, but we still are not really learning these lessons. So as a diversity and inclusion educator and dean, what how did you interpret this last week?
I don't think I was ready for the question to be phrased though. I think this is the problem though, right? Like, we got to stop interpreting and we just got to name stuff for what it is. That like was so clear. It's like white privilege on display, whiteness on display. Like, I I remember, right, like leaving an interview, going into the living room with my wife and looking at the TV and just being like and 100 different emotions at the same time, right? Because one of the first ones I'm looking at is like, what is happening? I love to watch those really dramatic America's Amazing shows, like the White House has got blown up and, the white hero saves the president. Love those. Didn't expect to see it on my TV today. Um, and then these other emotions that are coming through as I'm watching, like, wait, they're not getting shot. Like, I don't want to see anybody
Right.
die on my television. And this is wow. So then these like anger, right? Like, I became incensed to just this level of permissiveness
Mm.
for me, like just permissiveness to like do what you're doing.
Mm.
Like, we welcome you. And then these like layers of like, yeah, no, there's no, oh man, I didn't actually read the transcripts from Michael Brown's trial. I
Mm.
could only like hear what some folks said, but there is that quote, right, from I believe from the officer that talks about like, fearing for my life, and something about, seeing him as like, I don't know, like the way he's coming at me like a beast, like just some way of like, right, making, like a monster, a beast or animal, right, out of. And the more I learn about the brain, right, recognizing that like, yeah, totally possible that you all have warped, right, folks into being this like threat to you. What was clear is that what you don't see is white armed mobs as threats.
Right.
okay, cool. Right. Like, so is this a reminder? Not surprising, right? Like not things that, because we've seen, there were a couple of times over the past 5 years where white armed folks have like taken over state government areas, national parks. Like, you remember those? Or even just like every time Black or Indigenous or person of color gets unarmed, get right murdered by the police, and then someone shows like another example of an armed white person going towards the police, and the police, still like, no, 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 listen, we can diffuse this. So it wasn't surprising to me, that reminder that white terror doesn't is not fearful
Mm,
to
mm,
white folks,
mhm,
but it's like it doesn't continue to like, it doesn't mean that it stops me from like being angered and in sense of knowing that like, yeah, like I don't want to hear anybody. And I know that we have students who say like, well, they learned right
mm,
from the Black Lives Matter protests. And so they're trying to now be more nonviolent. Yeah, I don't want those inaccuracies being told, right? Like we've actually got to do more truth telling about the realities of the fact that they did not fear white terror.
mm,
Let's talk about why, right? Like,
mm,
and then let's talk about some of the irrational and racist fears of,
mm,
folks of color. And so, yeah, my perception
mm,
was a lot. It was a lot, but because things were coming at right all of these angles,
mm,
of not shocked that anything like this could happen. Because to me, I'm like totally on brand, totally makes sense. Um, given the permissiveness that we've allowed
mhm,
throughout our entire history. And
mhm,
so the fact that some of the things that should have been a drawn the line for people have not,
mm,
um, then it didn't surprise me that this one also, national TV, people wrote, I mean, like, and I think where I had those moments of disgust is where it felt like violations of people, like, the guy sitting at, Nancy Pelosi's desk,
mm,
or like
mm,
people leaving with objects, stuff like that. It like the levels of violation that were also just like, and now walk safely out of the building,
mm,
please.
mm,
Not handcuffing you all, not barricading, like
mm,
it
mhm,
just also let me know, I got to really be super mindful
mm,
of where I am and how I show up, because
mhm,
it's so clear how
mm,
differently we are going to be experiencing this place called America.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
yeah, yeah.
You talked about history, and it brings to mind Birth of a Nation, and also, uh, James Baldwin's quote, I'm not the N word. Y'all created the N word because
Mm,
you needed the boogeyman. And my
mhm,
friend was
mhm,
saying, these folks are maybe the white N word. Like this is the real boogeyman. And in terms of 1915 Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, they have that iconic scene where there are, you know, poor black people that I guess are elected to Congress, and they literally put their foot up on the desk, in or
mhm,
the lectern in uh, the House of Representatives, and they're eating fried chicken, and they're barefoot, and
mm,
so it's showing, right,
mm,
that this poverty and this blackness is going to sully our government. And when I
mm.
saw and they weren't poor white folks. We were talking about this before the thing. They bought an airplane ticket.
These
They
are folks that had access. Yeah, yeah.
Some of them, like some was, I don't know, a firefighter in Brooklyn, and someone was a police officer, and someone was a lieutenant colonel, and someone was right from San Diego in the Air Force for 14 years. So these were like whatever middle class or I don't know, white folks who had means, and they were sullying and killing a police officer. I mean, unfortunately, that
Mhm.
Ashley Babbitt, that young woman, got killed, but it's an interesting thing to direct the anger and ire of America onto uh, working class and poor black folks for a long, long time. And then for, again, the chickens to come home to roost of like, this is the real problem in America. Um,
Yeah.
and if we don't,
Well,
go ahead, go
I
ahead.
was
No,
going to say, in the reality, though, it has always been, right? Has always been, but that's the power of narrative, the power of stereotyping that then we, right, like plant as truth, because they can do all of this. And in my eyes, yes, now I'm looking at any white folk that I don't know to just be like, you need to really let me know your stance before
Mhm,
I can trust you.
mhm.
But in the global eyes,
Yeah.
that they're not going to shame the name of white folks collectively, because that's not how we see and view them.
Right.
Um, and like they know that,
Right.
and I think that's always been the case in America, right? I can only speak for that, right? Like I've done extensive research elsewhere, but like that being it is like they always have been the
And then
problem.
and that's the thing. Germany was forced to pay reparations to Jewish folks who were in the concentration camps. Germany just paid $662 million to Jewish folks who are struggling in COVID. Germany was
Mm,
forced to tend to the grave sites and the cemeteries of Jewish folks in Germany. Imagine the US government being forced to pay out reparations first, second, to keep up Black cemeteries that, some of them have been lost to time, right? Native American cemeteries, we don't even know where they are
we're
anymore.
still building, we're building over those, right? Like
Correct, correct. And I don't want folks that are listening to this session to think, well, it's time to stick it to whitey and like, white folks are all bad and blah blah blah. That's not the point. The point is understanding the history of this country and the sickness of the last 400 years and probably prior to that. And no country can get well until you deal with the sickness. And the whole point is this is our home too. We live here. We want this place to be better for us, for our, our kids,
yeah,
our grandparents, whatever it is. And we care and love on this place. And we want other folks to love on it and care for it and not demonize each other so that they can say there's a conspiracy that everyone in the government is some type of child molester. But just as you and I are talking about changing the structures of K through 12, K through 16, and we said desegregate, the board of trustees and the donors and whatnot. I want the listeners to also remember Senator Kamala Harris is ascending and going to the vice president's office. There will be zero Black women in the Senate, zero Black women in the Senate. And
mm-hmm,
now that
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Reverend Warnock won in Georgia, there will be 3 Black men in the Senate. And
mm-hmm,
so if and then we've had 1 Black president, right? Out of what, 46 now?
mm-hmm.
If we are not able to change the power structures of our schools, how the heck are we going to change the power structures of our country? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there's
And again, like, right, and
no,
even if those structures start to get representation on them, if the actual foundation and work that folks are doing is not true and honest and deep and real, we'll just keep this cycle going, because
yeah,
there's been representation before, there's been like, so even those boardrooms, right? Like I don't want, those boardrooms to get more racially or any other level of representation diverse if they're then going to be met with trauma and denial and
yeah,
dismissive once they get there.
right,
Um,
right.
yeah,
That's right. That's right.
all of that.
And there's one Latina woman, Cortez Masto from Nevada, who's in the Senate, and
Yeah.
California, who we're aren't we the most populous state? Or maybe it's Texas to New York. We are very much up
I
there,
can't. Yeah.
and we have a large Latinx population, and only now, and we used to be part of Mexico, and only
Yeah.
now are we having our first senator, who Alex Padilla, who's a Latino man. Um, so we have a lot of work to do, and I think you raise a great point.
Yeah.
We don't want folks to just go in there and then be traumatized, and they have to drop out because,
Yeah.
again, the white system is on them and traumatizing them, and that's what happens to a lot of our
Yeah.
students. But that's why we do the work that we do, because we
That's it.
know
That's it.
that student, staff, faculty drop out, fall out, or even maybe even
Or
more,
pushed out.
or pushed out, or stay in and are toxified
Not
every
well.
day and knocked down, and the whole thing just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
And additionally, though, we don't want those folks to go in, folks of any like marginalized white background to go in, having not done the work themselves too.
right.
Because that can also be some of the most poisonous, right? Is that whiteness doesn't just apply to folks with white skin. And so thinking about some of the ways in which we can replicate, you know, yeah, we can replicate systems of oppression if we are not aware of what we're carrying for ourselves, like my own internal biases, right? Like internal racism, things like that, and then also some of the other areas beyond my racial identity, right? Like I needed to learn quickly about my ableism, so that I wasn't in these positions, being more oppressive to folks with disabilities. Like it's, yeah,
Right, because and we'll wrap it up in a second here because I know we got to go, but we don't the idealized future is not black and brown and queer folks running the show who are equally as hyper capitalistic, who are equally as hyper corporate and toxic as the white folks that preceded them. That's not progress. That's just like
right.
a melanin, transformation, but the same
Yeah,
type of
we got to
toxicity.
get real about power, right? Like what that power is going to mean, and understanding then like my role in that power position and the responsibility I have, or truth telling about like, whether or not I'm going to take that on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We gotta wrap up here, but is there something that you would like to say to K through 16 educators about something creative, exciting that they can change in this coming
Mm.
year, whether systemically or even just small on an individual level for their classroom or whatever it may be?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, like I always the first thing that I always tell educators is like do the personal work, like do the inside out work. It is never you should never stop coming back to, okay, wait, how are my biases showing up? How are, like how is my privilege impacting, my thoughts on it? Like keep doing that work. So if you have jumped to action in other ways, which a lot of us, right, like that savior mentality, I'm jumping to like, oh, they need me, so I'm going to save them. But I haven't actually like thought about the ways I'm going to be showing up in that space. Like just do that. And that in itself is work, and don't let anyone fool you that you need to be out here, waving banners on social media showing all the work that you've done until you do some internal work, and just keep coming back to that. And then the second thing I would say is like build a community of folks who are doing anti-bias, anti-racism work, so that as you hit those moments of like, oh crap, I messed up here, or I got to be stretched in this way, I need to do some work in this area, that you have folks around you who, one, are going to do some truth telling with you,
Mm,
like, let you know, yeah, hey, you got to work on this. Here are some resources, but then who you can also like be in conversation with, because we should not be doing this work by ourselves or in silos. We need to be doing this work in community. And by just sitting, reading a book, talking to yourself about it, or talking to folks who are dismissive of the work you're doing, that's not going to help to stretch you and help you grow where you need to be. So build up your community and just keep doing that internal work to
mm,
focus on yourself,
mm.
and
Um,
not a selfish way, but like in a like, I
yeah.
need to be better for the community I'm serving.
Right. Constant. So what I'm hearing is your first point is constantly
Self-reflection.
questioning, what am I doing? Am I like, who am I doing it for? How am I doing it? And number
Yeah. How am
two,
I showing up? Yeah.
and number two, building that community that you can bounce ideas off of. Like, is this effed up? Like, am I forgetting
That's
like an
it.
identity group here? Blah, 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 blah. Right. Right. Building that
Yeah. Yeah.
community.
And examining, right, like who that community is. If you can only turn to folks who share identities with you,
Mm.
that's a good another critical point of self-reflection and examination, right? So don't quickly then go and pick a bunch of friends. but sit with that for a second, right? Like answer the why, right? And I think that too is so powerful, so that people don't become your token friends for particular types of identity markers, but you at least understand like, oh, okay, here's what was going on now, and now I need to actually seek out some relationships beyond my comfort zone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if the CEOs of companies listen to what you just said, if the presidents and boards listen to
Uh-oh.
what you just said of schools, it would be a better, environment for all of us. So
Yeah.
I hope they listen. I hope they listen to you. This has
Yeah.
really been fun. This is Tamisha.
I agree.
I want to go another hour and talk more about this stuff. And we got to do that at another date, because I think there's other
Yes.
stuff that
Yes.
we have to touch upon.
Yeah.
But thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thank
CommunityWorksInstitute.org.
you.
Check us out. K through 16 education, and we have talks like this at our Winter Institute. You should all tune in to that. And wow.
Oh, if you want to keep in touch with me,
Please tell us, how do we get at? Yeah.
Yeah. Feel free to Twitter, I feel like is my most active. So at Tamisha, TAM as in Mary, ISHA, and then _ consult, like a consultation, but without the Asian. So Tamisha _ consult. And then you can also find other ways of finding me at TamishaWilliams.com.
Beautiful. And you do diversity consulting. Right? You have people can utilize your professional.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. About to go into a health and wellness kind of reflection space with educators and a little bit here later this afternoon. So.
Okay. Beautiful. You're
Yeah.
working on a Sunday. I love it. All right, everybody. Tune into our show on Friday and Sunday. Be safe, be happy. And 2021 is going to be a different year. Hopefully a better one. Fingers crossed. Peace, everybody.
We got this.